Good morning. My name's Shirley, and I teach over at Oklahoma Academy. That's very loud. It's talking back to me. I want to thank Pastor Norman for inviting me to speak here, and you for extending your hospitality. And I want to welcome all the other guests who are here with me now, though I'm sure you're more comfortable than I am. And to everyone that's watching online, if you're sick or maybe haven't even been here before, we'd like to welcome you to come visit here. Am I all right in moving this a little bit, or am I just on this one? I'm on this one? Can I move this? Great. I'm going to tell you a few scenarios of people being deceived, good people, smart people, many of them Christians. I'll add a few comments. And the big issue that I see is they put their trust in men. And I keep thinking, as I hear people talk about this or that person that's going to do so many great things, that God doesn't have any approbation for us in that mindset. He says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man, who makes the arm of flesh his strength." And it just seems so odd to me that we as people hang on to other people when that's one thing that God specifically says to you and to me: you're cursed if you do it. Now, one thing I don't want is God's curse, and I don't think anyone here does. So the song, Michael, you did a much better job than I ever did, which is probably why Julie was always nervous when I say, "Yeah, I think I can sing along with you." But that song, "Come Home," when I would visit my family in Georgia, I had an aunt. She would always say, "When are you coming home, Trey?" But the interesting thing about it was, it wasn't when are you moving back to Georgia, it's when are you going to start coming back to the church you were born in? When are you going to come home? And as you probably know, because I heard some of you in Sabbath school talk about the news, there are some people that will never come home this week. And I'm specifically thinking of those that decided that they trusted the maverick ideas of a man named Stockton Rush. Is everyone with me on that? You know what I'm talking about? Well, there was a man named Stockton Rush, and he liked being on the cutting edge of everything. And he said, "I know I've broken some rules in the way I built my submarine, but and it was uncertified. Submarines that go down to this depth, there's certification processes." And he says, "Those processes, they don't meet my cutting-edge technology." And people trusted him. At the tune of $250,000 a head, they trusted him. And in 2021, a group of people went down and looked at the Titanic in that same vehicle, and it came back up. In 2022, people went down and they trusted him in the same vehicle, and they came back up. But Sunday, they didn't come up. Because one of the things about this vehicle is it's built out of carbon fiber, which is stronger than steel for its weight, but it's very brittle. And another issue is that it's made like you might make, like I've always wanted to make a Kevlar canoe. It's made with an epoxy and a layer of this film, and then epoxy and a layer of this film. And you build it up, and they have made this tunnel out of this capsule out of this. But when it gets under stress, as it breaks apart, it starts to delaminate. So each layer was coming apart from the next. And they had sensors inside that would tell them, just kind of like we do. Have you ever noticed? I heard it in Sabbath school this morning. We have a sensor. It's almost time for us to be ready when we see the Sunday law being passed. But once that sensor goes off, is there time to get ready? There isn't. And so they very possibly had those sensors go off. And those sensors going off just told them, "You're dead. It's over. It's over." Now, one of those guys that was down there, he was the world's leading authority on the Titanic. He had made 37 other visits to that, and he had pulled up about 5,000 artifacts, but in different vessels. And the young man, the 19-year-old that went down, he was terrified. He really didn't want to go, except he wanted to please his dad, and it was Father's Day weekend. And that's why he went. So this is kind of just the latest iteration of Icarus flying too close to the sun. Except for this time, he was too close to the bottom. And the pressure, they say, was about 6,000 pounds per inch on that vessel. And with one little pinhole, it was all over. Have you ever heard of, you have possibly heard of James Cameron. James Cameron is a filmmaker. He filmed the movie Titanic, a big blockbuster, named after a famous ship. But he's been down there himself 33 times. And he built a submarine that went all the way down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. So he understood how these things were built. And he and other people had relayed to Stockton Rush, we think your ship is dangerous. We don't think it will work well. And he said, I'm struck by the similarity of the Titanic disaster and of the Titan that went down looking for it. The captain was told over and over, it's dark, it's night, there's an ice field, don't go full steam ahead. He went full steam ahead. Stockton Rush was told over and over, we think your ship is flawed. Pieces on that ship are not rated for that depth. Don't keep doing it. And he rushed on. And the thing that Cameron said in the end is, I regret not speaking up more. Now, there's a lot I'm sure that we could talk about that we need to talk about in this congregation. But one of the things that I hope we don't ever have to say is we regret not speaking up more. We regret not saying the things that needed to be said. Have you ever heard of British mathematician Alan Turing? Just me being able to read off of this computer is some of the benefit we have from Alan Turing's work. But the other benefit that at least some of you who followed World War II would be familiar with is he's the one that was the leader of the team that broke the code on the Enigma machine. Raise your hand if you know what the Enigma machine is. Okay. It was kind of a typewriter that had different dials on it, and the Germans would use it to transcribe their messages and send them out, and they were coded messages. And he broke the code. He could tell us what the enemy was doing. Unfortunately, he didn't always know what he was doing. And so Alan Turing, he was afraid, logically, because the British were being bombarded, and he thought, if the Germans come over, I don't want to lose my fortune. So he turned everything he had into silver, and he went out into Bleakley Park Forest, and he buried it. And being the intelligent mathematician that he was, knowing that people could just read a map, he created a cipher. And that cipher would tell him exactly how to get back to his treasure when everything was safe. Except for, I guess, with all the bombing and whatever else was going on, the landmarks changed, and he never did find his silver. It was lost, completely lost. In 1952, 2 years before his death, he was seen in Bleachley Park Forest with a metal detector, still looking for his treasure. That's much worse than losing your keys. Corrie ten Boom, you may be familiar with this. After World War II, she traveled, she worked in evangelism and tried to help heal some of the scars in the world. But she wrote a letter to American pastors in 1974. Is anyone familiar with that? If you are, raise your hand. She wrote a letter to the American pastors in 1974, and she said, I am really concerned for you because you keep preaching this idea that the Christians are going to be raptured away before any trouble comes. And she said, before the communist revolution in China, the Chinese pastors were preaching the same thing to their people. And one bishop in the Chinese church said, I wish that we'd prepared them for the tribulation. And during this time in 1973, 74, she said she had been in one of the countries in Africa where the government had changed and the African church was being wiped out, systematically wiped out. She said she went to this nation, and the first day she was there, members of the church that she was going to speak at were called in to register, taken off and killed in the night. The next group was called in the next day. On the fourth day, she spoke to this church, and they all came, but their eyes were wild because they knew that at any moment they could disappear too. And so she told them a story that I'm sure you're familiar with, if you're familiar with The Hiding Place, the story of when she was a child, and she said, I'm scared I won't be ready to be a martyr for Christ. And her dad said, when we go to Amsterdam, when do I give you the money for the ticket? Do I give it to you 3 weeks in advance? And she said, no, you give it to me right before we get on the train. And she told this story to this African congregation. And they realized that whatever was going to happen, God could give them the strength that they needed, but they didn't need the strength right then. And they sang, Shall We Gather at the River? They prayed together. Within a few months, the whole congregation had been obliterated. But she said, I was so glad that unlike many of their leaders, I had the Word of God. Now, those leaders had the Word of God as well. But she said, I had been to the Bible and discovered that Jesus said he had not only overcome the world, but to all those who remain faithful to the end, he would give a crown of life. And she passed that on to that congregation. So today what I'm thinking is that Paul says he died daily. And he said that we need to examine ourselves frequently to see whether we're in the faith. Not just whether we're in the church, but whether we're in the faith. And I appreciate that Amos 3:7 says, surely the Lord God will do nothing except he reveals it before by his prophets. And so, if we stand by this, then we'll be fine. Matthew 24 gives us kind of an overview of what Jesus told would happen between his time and the time when he returned. And Matthew 25 warns us about the trouble we can be in. You remember, all of the virgins slept, but only half of them were saved, and that by the skin of their teeth. And Peter reminds us that the righteous will barely be saved. And it doesn't mean that we have to barely be saved. It's just kind of the nature of things. If you sleep and you're awakened, you're not quite ready for everything. But he says, I've prayed for you. I've prayed for you that your faith won't fail. And so I want us to look a little bit at maybe those that have gone before us. How about the disciples? They were asking him in Matthew 24. They were pointing out the temple, and then I guess it's in Acts 1, after he's resurrected, they're still on this mindset that they'd gotten from the scribes and the Pharisees, that this was going to be some military overthrow. And they said, will you now restore the kingdom? So they still had this mindset. They had the best teacher in the world. They were told as much as Jesus could tell them, and still they were confounded when he died on the cross, right? And we can think, well, we're like the disciples, we at least know as much as that. But really, as a church, we're probably like the church of Jesus' day. Not all of us are in the position of being right by Jesus every day, except that we can be right here in his word. What about the Millerites? They were some of the best Bible students there were. I understand one of the last editions of Signs of the Times before 1844 was 250 pages. And as you might know, Joseph Bates visited somewhere and spoke for a whole week, all day long on the Sabbath. And in our family, when we read about that, as well as giving meetings on the topic each night, and we thought, how can you find that much to talk about the Sabbath? All day long, every day. Who knows how long he kept that guy on the bridge when he said, what's new? All we know is when the guy walked off the bridge, he was converted to the idea of the Sabbath. But the Millerites, they studied deeply, and yet from an estimated 50 to 100,000 Millerites, 2 days after 1844, after October 22, there were about 50 believers left. And what about this one? The angels. A third of them followed Satan. But we're told the other 2/3 didn't fully feel strong in their position until after they saw Christ crucified. And so we can't imagine that we can't be fooled. But we do have some foolproof answers. The sign in Matthew 24 that concerns me the most is the warning Jesus gave for you and me about the attitude in the church at the time of the end. Does anyone remember what that attitude is? Let's look at it. It's Matthew 24, and we'll start a few verses before Matthew 24, verse 10. This is one attitude. We're told that those that love the law, nothing will offend them, and yet it says here, and many will be offended. Now he's talking to his disciples. He's talking about people in the church. He said, many will be offended and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise and deceive many. You do know, I teach in an Adventist school. We have Adventist students. We have students that came from very strong Bible backgrounds. And yet, when I mentioned in the freshman class this last year something about apostate Protestantism, one of the students said, I've never heard of that. What is it? Many false prophets shall rise and deceive many. And this is the part that I hate. It says, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. That doesn't even have to be the iniquity in your house or in your neighborhood. That can just be the iniquity you see on the television. But because that iniquity abounds and it bounces around in your heart and in your head, your love can be waxing cold. And I think we need to rebound from what's abounding. Proverbs 19:27 says, cease from the instruction that causes you to err. False theology is drunk with false ideas that lead them to be angry about the results of their unfaithfulness. Now, you know it, saying that the dragon was wroth with the woman. The woman, I better turn to it. Revelation 18:3. I thought I would make it clearer by rewording it, but I don't think I did. Revelation 18:3. All nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The wrath of her fornication. Let's look at that for a moment. What is that fornication? Speak real loud because you don't have a microphone.
False doctrine.
False doctrine. Yes. It's false doctrine. It's the mingling of beliefs with political ideas. And we're told that many will have a form of godliness but deny the power thereof. And we're told that denying that power is leaning on the state to do the work of the church. And when we lean on government to do God's work, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, we're denying the power of God. And we're saying, like Judas, I've got to help him because he's definitely not getting this right. And so it's this false doctrine. And false theology causes people to be drunk with ideas that lead them to be angry about the results of the unfaithfulness they see around. And the unfaithfulness comes from the false theology. It's just this loop that goes around and just makes you crosser and crosser and crosser. So I think we need to be aware that we don't want to follow the latest, the greatest, the men of the world, and suffer the impending realities that could disrupt our lives like an overwhelming flood. When those men were in that submersible this last week, I understand they let go of the weights and they were headed for the top. They knew something was wrong. But it was too little too late. It came in like an overwhelming flood. And I'm sorry to remind you, but they did not find any bodies down there. That's how fast this tore apart. There was nothing left. That's an overwhelming flood. And we're told that the events that we're coming up against will come across the world like an overwhelming flood. But we're told, don't let you be deceived. You've got my words, you've got my spirit. Don't let it do that to you. And so 2 Timothy 2:23, and this is probably the New Living Translation, it says, don't get involved in foolish, ignorant arguments that only start fights. That's the kind of thing that can lead people to be offended, right? A servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but must be kind to almost everyone. Right? No. To everyone. Jesus said, pray for your enemies. Must be kind to everyone. Must be able to teach. Must be patient with difficult people. Just like my wife is patient with me. Gently instruct those who oppose the truth. Perhaps God will change those people's hearts and they will learn the truth. Then they will come to their senses and escape from the devil's trap. For they have been held captive by him to do whatever he wants. When you see someone that opposes the truth, someone that's speaking things that you know to be false, don't be mad at them. They're being held captive by Satan. Speak gently. Help them to come to the truth. Jesus has a people who will follow him wherever he goes. Jesus has sheep who hear his voice. And they're not offended if someone calls them sheeple. Jesus will find faith on the earth when he returns. Jesus is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So we need to forsake all else. We need to let his mind be in us. That's what Jesus prayed for you and for me. When Corrie ten Boom spoke about the church in America, she pointed out that we sing a song and we say, "Let thy congregation escape tribulation." Well, you may have noticed I like that song, and that's the one that I picked for us to sing. But I've got a potential suggestion that we'll probably all forget in the next 3 minutes. Let's sing, "Let thy congregation be braced for tribulation." Am I leading the song, or are you? I'm going to slowly back away from the platform, and I hope you're leading the song.